Good morning. It's Friday, February 21st. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 504 days old. Tough day yesterday. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. In a major reversal of policy, a major revision of historical fact, President Donald Trump blamed Ukraine and its president, Vladimir Zelensky, for starting the war with Russia in 2022. This comes as Russia and the U.S. look to mend ties after years of political tensions. It also comes as Trump seeks to access Ukrainian rare earth minerals to compensate for the massive amount of assistance that the United States has provided to Ukraine over the last 2 years. I don't mind a little quid pro quo, but I am truly uncomfortable with some of this rhetoric. It's not helping anyone except for perhaps Vladimir Putin and maybe Xi Jinping or Ali Khamenei. Our guest today is Max Meizlish. He's a senior research analyst at FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, also known as CEFP. He focuses on the use of U.S. economic statecraft. Max, like me, is an alumnus of the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. Max handled complex sanctions enforcement cases when he worked there. Today, he and I are going to zoom in on South Africa, a government that has a troubling fixation on Israel and an affinity for Hamas terrorists, as demonstrated by their lawfare campaign against Jerusalem at the International Court of Justice. We're going to discuss President Trump's executive order halting all U.S. assistance to South Africa, Pretoria's status on the Financial Action Task Force gray list, it's called FATF, and we're going to talk about that and more. So tune in for that conversation in just a few minutes right here on the program. Hamas returned 4 bodies to Israel yesterday. 2 of them were the Bibas kids, and the emotional impact on Israelis was crushing. Hamas said it had also returned the body of Shiri Bibas, the mother of the Bibas kids, except in a strange twist, it wasn't her body. This sent the Israeli people into a white rage, and for good reason. But the drama didn't end there. Hamas officials in the West Bank claimed responsibility for a series of bombs that detonated around Tel Aviv. Nobody was injured. It appears that the timers were not set properly, and that meant 0 casualties. The Israelis got lucky. But here's what I want to know. What message was Hamas trying to send yesterday? They had Gazans cheering as the bodies of dead children were paraded through the streets. They switched up the body of a woman they murdered for some other unknown corpse, and they tried to carry out a mass casualty attack all in one day. None of this makes any sense to me. Is Hamas trying to pull Israel back into the Gaza war? Because Hamas knows that if Israel gets back into Gaza, it'll be a fight to the finish. Iran knows it too, and Israel maintains the advantage. It's not even close. So what's the Hamas strategy? It's not at all clear to me. Maybe it is to the IDF. If they plan to return to the battlefield, I strongly suggest they get a lock on what is going on here, and soon. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani was in Iran this week. He arrived in Tehran on Wednesday. The Emir and his delegation, which included Qatar's foreign minister, were welcomed by Iranian energy minister Abbas Ali Abadi at the airport. The Qatari leader then later met with Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. The meetings were all about deepening bilateral relations. Hamas's 2 state sponsors were seen embracing one another, just as Israel grappled with the return of 4 dead civilians from Hamas captivity. Just think about that for a minute. Khamenei had a request. He wants Doha to release Iranian oil revenues frozen in Qatari banks. By way of background, the previous Trump administration froze oil funds in South Korea as part of that maximum pressure campaign against Iran. In September 2023, the Biden administration unfroze the money to pay ransom for 5 American citizens imprisoned in Iran. Didn't recommend that. The money was transferred to Qatar. After October 7th, however, Doha agreed not to transfer those funds to Iran. But now, Khamenei wants Qatar to sidestep American pressure and open the financial spigot. $6 billion with a B hangs in the balance. That's a lot of money for terrorists and nukes. Headline 2, Arab leaders are meeting in Riyadh today to discuss alternatives to President Trump's vision for Gaza. Representatives from the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council countries are there. That's Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, and the UAE. Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority also sent representatives. A version of Egypt's nothing burger of a Gaza reconstruction plan is reportedly the basis for these discussions. Egypt hasn't unveiled its plan yet, but reports indicate that it will involve 2 or 3 phases over 3 to 5 years. On Wednesday, Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed told Secretary of State Marco Rubio that Abu Dhabi rejects any attempt to relocate Palestinians and that Gaza's reconstruction should be linked to the ever-elusive two-state solution. I can't imagine President Trump is going to be happy with that same old failed conception. Headline 3, Iran executed a record number of people in 2024. Get ready for this number. It's big. The Norway-based nonprofit Iran Human Rights reported that Islamic Republic executed at least 975 people last year. That's a 17% increase from 2023. IHR calculated that the regime killed an average of 5 people per day from October to December. 31 of the regime's victims were women. That's the highest number of women executed in the last 17 years by the Islamic Republic. Some of the executions were connected to the protests that swept through Iran in 2022 after the murder of Mahsa Amini. In August, a 34-year-old man was secretly executed on charges of killing an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officer during the protests. Iranian authorities reportedly extracted his confession through torture. Unless you think last year was an anomaly, we're barely 2 months into 2025, and the regime has already executed more than 120 people. And now it's time for that interview with Max Meizlish. He's been closely monitoring developments in U.S.-South Africa relations. This stuff is not our normal FDD Morning Brief material, but it's important stuff. So let's roll up our sleeves and get ready to learn about one of Hamas's top enablers around the world. Welcome to the program, Max Meizlish.
Hey, John, good to be with you.
All right, great to have you. Let's start with an overview. What are some of the foreign policies we see coming out of South Africa right now that has you concerned and that has FDD dialed in?
Yeah, thanks, John. Most importantly, we're looking at threats coming from China, Russia, Iran, and Hamas within the South Africa context. Certain of those entities, notably China, Iran, and Russia, are key members of the axis of aggressors. And what we're seeing is that South Africa is emerging as a notable enabler of this axis.
Now, when you say the axis of aggressors, maybe unpack that for a minute. What does that mean?
There's levels of coordination between China, Russia, Iran, and also North Korea. North Korea is a little bit less relevant in the context of South Africa. But these are countries that are aligning in various ways across the cyber domain, military domain, economic cooperation, and they rely on third-party support from countries such as South Africa that act as a way for them to advance their agenda throughout the world.
And so what does it mean when South Africa provides some assistance? I mean, does it mean that they all have bases there and that they're actively coordinating? I mean, how do we begin to quantify this?
So what we've seen in recent years is increased levels of military cooperation. We've seen South Africa host Russian and Chinese naval warships, actually on the anniversary of Russia's invasion into Ukraine. We've seen levels of cooperation where there were allegations that sanctioned Russian vessels carrying weapons that were heading towards the war front actually came and docked in South Africa, and South Africa overall just being an accommodating place for these bad actors.
Yeah, it's sort of like the cantina scene in Star Wars, the number of bad actors that somehow find their way to South Africa and have kind of called it home away from home. It was interesting. You and I were talking right before the program that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, is actually heading there as well upon the invitation of the South African leadership. So that's interesting, given the longstanding relationship that Russia has with South Africa. It looks like they are maybe in some way playing both sides of this, but I guess we're going to wait and see, and we'll have you back to discuss that. But I mean, some of this stuff is on the radar of the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF as it's known. You and I have worked on this issue. Both of us have done so at the Treasury Department. FATF is kind of like the United Nations of terrorism finance tracking. And they have South Africa on what they call the gray list. What does that mean?
Yeah, so for the listeners, I would describe FATF as being the international financial crime watchdog. So its role is essentially to assess risk in finance. And that's used a lot for private sector as they assess risk internationally, where to deploy capital. The reason why this is important, why South Africa being added to the gray list is notable, is that it's highlighting deficiencies in South Africa's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist finance regimes. FDD has written a lot about the extent to which Hamas appears to be operating in South Africa pretty freely, raising funds, having branches of designated organizations operating on the ground there. And certain of FATF's assessment is identifying deficiencies with respect to South Africa's compliance regime there.
Right. And compliance, though, it's interesting. I mean, when I worked on FATF, I mean, I would see countries that were hosting Hamas or Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda. That doesn't necessarily put you on the gray list, right? When you get in trouble with FATF, it's because your laws are often insufficient, or the structures that you have in place that you haven't declared properly what you deem to be illegal, or maybe you're not following up based on the laws that you've passed. So how to describe right now where the deficiencies are within South Africa?
Yeah, there's sort of a way to look at this along the technical lines and then more of the systemic lines. South Africa has made some improvements passing laws since they've been added to the FATF gray list, aimed at addressing certain of those deficiencies with respect to registries, looking into some levels of money laundering. But the real problem, and why I would hope that South Africa remains on the gray list for some time, is that the country appears to be lacking with respect to its ability to actually go after complex money laundering cases. They're extraordinarily deficient in this regard. And while most people in the United States, frankly, I think most observers of South Africa don't really know the history of corruption and state capture, which we can get into later in this conversation, South Africa is a country that has been overrun by corruption at the highest levels. And there have been very large bodies of work looking at the level in which state-owned entities have been overrun by bad actors. What FATF is highlighting. Oh, go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say that, what we're looking at basically is South Africa turning into something that looks sort of like the Cayman Islands, right? Where you kind of know that illicit finance is flowing through there because of the lack of controls. It's starting to get a reputation in that way. But the question I wanted to ask you next is just to talk about what does it mean if they don't tackle those deficiencies, right? There's the gray list. And then as I understand it, there's a dark gray list and then there's a black list. What's the process here for escalating pressure on a country like South Africa at FATF?
Yeah, John, I believe that the process would be that South Africa could remain on the gray list for some time. And as long as FATF understands that there's a commitment by the South Africans to make certain reforms, they can stay on that list. And if they don't have a commitment to making those reforms, they can proceed to the blacklist, which is where entities like Iran or North Korea exist, which would be detrimental for the economy because it would lead to a huge amount of capital flight from the country.
Yeah, and I think we're watching that carefully, and that could be something that maybe we want to push for as long as we continue to see the likes of Russia and China and Hamas and Hezbollah, spending a lot of time there and operating in that country. But interestingly, South Africa is now on the radar of the Trump administration. That was definitely not on my bingo card when Trump was elected. So tell us about the most recent executive order issued by the Trump administration targeting South Africa.
Yeah, John, important context for this. I agree. I was not expecting Trump to make this a major focus in his second term here, especially so early on. But this dates back to 2018 when Trump noted in a tweet, I believe, concern regarding certain land reform initiatives in South Africa. So fast forward to today, and South Africa passed and President Ramaphosa signed into law an expropriation law. It's controversial. I'm not a legal scholar on South African land reform. But the issue is that there's potential land could be expropriated, essentially taken from private actors without the opportunity for compensation. So it could be stolen. For that region, looking at Zimbabwe, there's been lots of property stolen without compensation. It's a concern for some. And this appears to be a concern for President Trump. Now, notably, this executive order that President Trump has put forward in just the first month of his second term in office also highlights the extent to which South Africa is increasingly engaging in malign foreign policy. He highlighted its cooperation with Hamas, its lawfare against Israel, its support for Iran. And these are notable steps taken by the administration. And I think, frankly, moving in the direction of the core elements of threats to our national interest beyond South Africa's domestic land expropriation.
Okay, that's going to be interesting. So now what about Congress? There seems to be increased congressional attention to South Africa's malign foreign policy. That wasn't on my radar either. I mean, nobody was really talking about South Africa a year ago. Now, all of a sudden, we're seeing a lot of this. So what's happening in Congress right now?
So critical background, South Africa is a participant in AGOA. It's the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It's a key tariff-free trade program sponsored by the United States for participating countries in Africa. The Biden administration authorized South Africa to participate in this program, but there's been increased attention, particularly because of the analysis put out by FDD and others on this subject about South Africa's malign foreign policy that's calling into question whether South Africa is truly eligible for this program on the basis that it's no longer supporting U.S. national interest and is actually taking steps to threaten that. So what do you see? You see Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Jim Risch identifying concerns with respect to South Africa's foreign policy. Recently, you have Ted Cruz, who's the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, coming out and saying, I'm going to investigate South Africa's foreign policy. This is particularly because of pressure South Africa's put on Taiwan to relocate its representative office from the capital out to Johannesburg. We also see other members of Congress. Recently, there was a congressional letter from Congressman Ogles, who sits on the National Security Subcommittee of the House Financial Services Committee, coming out and urging President Trump to revoke South Africa's AGOA status and actually consider severing certain diplomatic ties. Big, right? Big steps. Within the Trump administration, too, as informed by congressional experience, you see core members of the Trump foreign policy team that have taken historical perspectives with respect to South Africa that have been very critical. Mike Waltz, as a congressman before becoming the national security advisor, sponsored key legislation calling for reforms to the U.S. relationship with South Africa. Senator Rubio, at the time, who now is the Secretary of State, also took similar positions. And Elise Stefanik, lastly, who's nominated for the top position at the United Nations, has also similarly voiced concerns with respect to South Africa's lawfare against Israel.
All right, pass the popcorn. I'm going to be watching that. It's going to be really interesting. A question for you. You mentioned state capture. Some people say that the government of South Africa isn't even actually in charge. Experts use this term state capture to describe what has gone on there. It's not unique to South Africa, but certainly it seems to apply. So tell us, what does that mean and why that might actually apply to the government in Pretoria?
Yeah, so state capture is a really interesting concept where we look at the theft, essentially, of governments. And in South Africa in particular, it's been riddled with this problem. For a long period of time, I think about a decade, under the presidency of Jacob Zuma, who the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, actually served as the deputy for during this period of state capture. It ran essentially a mafia state where private actors, notably the Gupta family, which is a prominent crime family with ties to India, took over key state institutions. And the impact of this is present to this day. There hasn't been a lot of economic growth. Core essential services throughout South Africa are in a state of disrepair. The country has suffered from water crises, power crises. And for what is supposed to be the most financially advanced economy in Africa, South Africa doesn't paint a good picture for the continent. And with respect to state capture, I just pulled up, because I was listening to your program maybe a week or two ago, and you had Congressman Moskowitz on. And just to demonstrate the bipartisan nature of this concern, right, from Congress, but particularly to put a point on this with respect to state capture, he said something interesting. I think it's clear that they are wholly owned subsidiaries of the Chinese and the Russians. They've taken a lot of that money and they own the South African regime at the moment. So what we saw historically under President Zuma was state capture involving private entities from the Gupta family. What I want to know, and what it seems increasingly to be the case, as the congressman represented there on the show, is that state capture could be alive and well in South Africa today But who owns the country? It could be China, Russia, Iran, or elements in Hamas.
Fascinating stuff. For those who are interested, look up the Gupta papers, Gupta. A lot of this has actually been spilled in a document leak by a handful of journalists that's out there for all to read. So anyone curious to learn more about this potential state capture initiative, highly recommend that. Max, last question before I let you go. South Africa's Mineral and Petroleum Resources Minister says the country is open to nuclear cooperation with Russia and Iran. Is this real?
It's a good question. This is real time. What we're seeing is greater antipathy towards the United States from South Africa. And this minister in particular, who you mentioned, is coming out swinging against the United States. So is it possible that we could see South Africa cooperating with Russia or Iran? I think it's entirely plausible. What we saw is over the course of the last year, Gazprom Bank, which is a large Russian bank, recently sanctioned for its key role in the gas and oil flow from Russia, was curiously selected to be the financier for a refinery revitalization effort in South Africa. And that process eventually came to an end because they couldn't actually pay the bill. But it was Montashe, the minister who you mentioned, who boasted in front of Parliament saying, I'm not worried about sanctions. I don't think that there's any risk to us in dealing with the Russians. Now, come November of last year, and we actually go ahead and sanction Gazprom Bank, and that deal is dead.
All right, we're going to keep watching that. But I want to thank you, Max Meizlish, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thanks, John.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Andrea Stricker has produced a memo and a helpful visual for FDD on Iran's nuclear weaponization. Andrea emphasizes the urgent need for the Trump administration to reverse some of America's failed policies toward the regime in Tehran, which have only exacerbated the nuclear threat. She also highlights the opportunity for Washington and Jerusalem to strengthen their intelligence cooperation to address this growing danger. Iran's nuclear threat is a ticking time bomb. There is no time to waste. Sinan Jidi has penned an article for the publication 1945 about Trump's approach to the Middle East and its impact on regional power dynamics. As the administration bolsters its support for Israel, deepens economic ties with the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, and it adopts more of a hardline stance to Iran, Sinan notes that Turkey seems to be left out in the cold. It's obviously deserved. Turkey acts like a rogue state even while it operates within the umbrella of NATO. And I, for one, am glad to see it. I hope it continues. Lastly, Toby Dershowitz from FDD Action has teamed up with Eitan Fischberger, a talented researcher, for a piece in Real Clear World about Al Jazeera potentially providing material support for Hamas. Not exactly surprising, given that Al Jazeera is funded by Qatar, which also funds Hamas. So yeah, the math checks out, but I highly recommend you read this one, folks. It's an important piece. And that's it for this Friday episode of the FDD Morning Brief. If you're craving more, feel free to check out the expert analysis on our website, FDD.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or check out our Instagram and YouTube channels and make that tax-deductible donation at FDD.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. I don't know who the guest is going to be, but I promise you it will be a good one. Until then, have a restful weekend. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.